Hello, I'm Aimée Little. I'm the director of the YEAR Centre, which stands for the York Experimental Archaeological Research Centre at the University of York, and I'm really delighted to be here today, and just a huge thank you to the organisers for putting together this conference, which must have been extremely complicated, I can imagine. I just wanted to really introduce SUN, which stands for Support Ukraine Network, which is a kind of a grassroots movement to support our Ukrainian colleagues. The premise of this really, just to give you a little bit of background, I guess the first point at which I started to think about this was I had somebody contact me on Facebook saying that they were a PhD researcher from Ukraine and that they were really struggling to get hold of resources and to make those sort of really crucial connections that would help with their research. And at first I have to admit I was a little bit suspicious. I was like, what, really? Someone in Ukraine still working on their PhD project on experimental archaeology? Surely, you know, people aren't still focused on experimental archaeology in Ukraine. There's a war going on. Anyway, I Googled him and I saw that actually, yes indeed, he is a researcher doing a PhD at a university in Ukraine and was genuinely struggling to get hold of resources. And of course, his whole research network had collapsed because of the war. And it made me realize that there were probably more people experiencing these challenges, not just in terms of their PhD studies, but in terms of other aspects of cultural heritage, life, and so forth in Ukraine. And it was at that point in time that I reached out to Roeland and to EXARC more generally and said, what can we do about this? What do you think? To me, it seems like there is a genuine need here to support Ukrainian experimental archaeologists. And as you can see, we've actually created, thanks to our colleagues in Ukraine, specifically Yarema and Olga, who is also a Ukrainian now working at the British Museum, this network, which we hope is the beginning of something really big and long-lasting. And my job here today is to really just give an introduction to this network and kickstart a conversation about what the practicalities of this network is, thinking about the longer term benefits, and also thinking about some of the sort of shorter term needs as well. So, as you can see from this slide here, it is really about helping not just experimental archaeologists, but open air museums, live interpreters, and also ancient craft experts who are still practicing and opening their doors to the public in Ukraine. And thanks to Yarema, I've included this slide because I think it's particularly important to see the type of work that is going on in Ukraine and how it's having an effect, not just on those PhD researchers, but actually right down to the level of school children, some of which we have in our room today with us, all the way from Ukraine. And some of the work that's going on in Ukraine involves these sorts of craft workshops at living history museums, where Ukrainian children who have been exiled because of the war from eastern Ukraine and now have had to be relocated to western Ukraine are participating in different types of medieval reenactment and crafting activities for many reasons, to connect, I guess. And I think Yarema is better placed to talk about some of these things than I am as a non-Ukrainian. But from my understanding, to really help them connect with their national identity, but also to help them work through some of their trauma. And I think many of us here in this room today who work in the field of craft, when I say that craft can have quite a therapeutic effect and it can really help with a general feeling of well-being and social connectedness, I think many people in this room probably can relate to that. So it's perhaps no surprise then that these places have become really powerful places for Ukrainians affected by the war to actually come together, express their cultural identity, to connect with their Ukrainian heritage, but also for them to have a space which promotes health and well-being more generally. So just a kind of background, what is actually still happening, what is currently happening in Ukraine at the moment. So what is the Support Ukraine network doing? Well, we're trying to, this is what we're attempting to do, and what this meeting is about really, is to think about how we can provide support for these different institutions, for the open-air museums, for the individuals who are still trying to practice experimental archaeology, and those traditional craft practitioners who are so important to the continuation of knowledge about different types of specialist craft work in Ukraine. We're also thinking about ways that we can help those students and researchers right through to the PhD level to access that really critical body of literature that they might be missing and struggling to get hold of, to try and help them make those vital connections, which is so important, as we know, and that's part of the reason many of us are here, that will help them keep their research networks alive, because why should those have to close down? Why should the networks have to close just because, you know, Russia has invaded Ukraine? We don't want our fellow colleagues in academia to be disadvantaged in any way, so how can we keep those links alive? And also, really to think about how we can build this kind of global network which would see Ukrainian partners twinned with not just partners in Europe, and unfortunately Britain, who is now sadly no longer apparently part of Europe, but we still feel very much connected in many ways to Europe, and are very sad about not being part of Europe, and also global partners. So how can we make a twinning program which would see Ukrainian institutions or organizations, museums, right down to the individual craft specialists who perhaps would like some support from somebody else who shares a similar interest and knowledge from another part of the world. So what's been going on? Well, I'm sorry, this slide needs a bit of a tweak, but already Ukraine has had its first experimental archaeology and living history conference, which by the sounds of it was a huge success, and is going to be the first of many to come. And of course now we have our first in-person meeting of the SUN network here in Turin, and this is going to be the first of many, I hope. We wish to now really have a general conversation with people like yourselves about how we can perhaps advance the network. What is it that we can do on the ground? What are the sort of the practical capabilities, but also some of the limitations that we might be facing? And really just to garner interest and support from the experimental archaeology community.
And here it was that Yarema's.
Okay.
Thank you for this beautiful event. My name is Yarema Ivantsiv. My wife Maria and I have been working 17 years in the direction of research, preservation and interpretation of Ukrainian cultural heritage. I am the head of NGO Cherno Galach, which is basically a reenactment club of Middle Ages, but it also cooperates with various reserves in the direction of holding events on historical topics in Ukraine. We think it is necessary to start our report with a very short but important review of the history of museum work in Ukraine, so that we better understand what we can have in common and what is different, what can be interesting to each other and in what way. Already in the first half of 19th century, the first museums of various profiles were organized. Some of them were created at universities. From the second half of the 19th century, the museum developed a number of institutions. There were opened different kinds of museums, municipal, private, under the various societies. This time also were a large scale of archaeological research on the territory of Ukraine, which at that time was territorially part of the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires. Ancient cities in the south of Ukraine were discovered: Olvia, Kerch, Khersones, paleolithic sites, Scythian royal mounds, medieval cities. Reserves and museums are created on the basis of these places of interest. In 1917, there were 35 museums operating in Ukraine. At the same time, nature reserves are being created on the basis of archaeological sites. The first open-air museums in Ukraine were created from 1926 to 1929. This work was completed thanks to a number of museum organizers, patrons and enthusiasts from all over Ukraine. This period is associated in our country with the names of Andrei Sheptytsky, Ilarion Sensitsky, Mikhailo Dragan, Vikenty Khvoyko, Dmytro Yavornitsky, and many others. These people were among the founders of museology in Ukraine. They were truly devoted to their work and devoted their lives to it. As an example, you can see the photo of Dmytro Yavornitsky, who was a prominent archaeologist and worker for 30 years, conducted archaeological research, organized ethnographic collections, and as an experiment swam across the Dnipro River rapid on the oak tree. And his photo, which is about 100 years old, is a vivid example of how a scientist who immerses himself in a certain historical period unwittingly becomes a part of it. We can probably call this photo the beginning of a reenactment in Ukraine. This is the Cossack in the right. It was really cool. The development of the museum's business in Ukraine followed a path similar to the examples of other European countries, until the moment when the repressions by the communist regime intensified. In 1917, when museums were nationalized, some of them were destroyed, collections were exported to other countries. And in 1930s years, when Communist Party members decided to reorganize museums into propaganda departments, systematic destruction of intellectual strata of society, appropriation of collections. It led to the fact that the development of the museum business slowed down significantly for dozens of years and lagged behind the general European one. Even in these difficult conditions, there were people who did not stop working. For example, during the Second World War, archaeologist Yaroslav Pasternak, Ivan Starchuk, one of those who conducted archaeological expeditions and made significant discoveries, which caused them problems with the authorities of that time. In this record, Yaroslav Pasternak emigrated to Canada. During the 70s, 80s years, the number of open-air museums on the territory of Ukraine increased to 30. With the achievement of independence, Ukrainians faced the new tasks, rethinking their history, searching for new ways of interpreting cultural heritage, a long process of reorientation from Moscow as a scientific and cultural center. Identification of artifacts that were exported. During the independence, more than 30 historical reserves were created. Today, there are 65 historical and archaeological reserves in Ukraine. Part of the work was the reformation of the existing ones, since every museum had a department devoted to communist ideology. I will name a few that made progress towards the development during independence: Baturin, Tripilya culture, Tustan, Khortytsa, Stone Grave, etc. Some of them were the first attempts to reproduce ancient technologies and crafts, such as the construction of Cossack ship Chaika and the reproduction of ancient settlements at the base of Triple Culture Reserve. This period, the reenactment movement was born in Ukraine, which over time became the integral part of the activities of many of these institutions. But now we talk more about the institutions that joined the Sun initiative. We know how expensive the interrupted system of scientific procedures, the educational process, and the separation of society from cultural issues, and what consequences this has. We cannot allow the doings of the beginning of the middle of the 20th century to repeat themselves again. This war has sharpened the sense of personal responsibility in Ukraine. It was very difficult to observe the destruction of cultural heritage, the destruction of architectural examples, and the theft of museum collections in the spring of last year. In contrast to this, museum workers relied and began to save monuments and collections from destruction wherever possible. An even more difficult aspect is receiving news about deaths of friends and colleagues. These are heavy losses, often of narrow-profile specialists who went to the front following the call of the heart and duty, such as our colleague from Dalny Plisnensk Reserve, Andriy Filipchuk, who died at the beginning of February. Ivo Regel is an artist and blacksmith who making medieval weapons, a reenactor from Lviv. Those funerals we attended a month ago. In memory of them and with the understanding that emotions need to be put aside and work even more efficiently, we came here. In 2022-2023, archaeological expeditions and conferences were held in Ukraine. Museums held thematic excursions and craft workshops. A periodical on historical topics was published. We also took part in archaeological research, organized an event on a historical theme at the base of the Tusten Reserve, where psychologists work and art therapy took place. Its participants were children who suffered as a result of the war. An extraordinary event last year was the creation of Sun Initiative, within the framework of which we have already managed to take a number of steps. Involvement of representatives of historical cultural reserves and craftsmen in the initiative from different regions of Ukraine, dealing with different historical periods from the 4000 BC to the 17th century AD. Of course, only those who can be an active participants at the moment, since a large number of colleagues are mobilized to serve in the armed forces in Ukraine. Although two of the participants of the initiative are currently serving in the armed forces of Ukraine, PhD archaeologist Andriy Petrauskas and director of Kamenets-Podilsky Museum, Alexander Zaremba. We sent our request and received 8 interviews of people with different profiles: a reenactor, craftsman, a researcher, a manager, directors of historical and cultural reserves, the head of the Union of Archaeologists in Ukraine. The interviews were published in the online EXARC journal, where you can find them. On March 23-24, the Living History and Experimental Archaeology was held, as Aimée said. As a result, was created a group of development of experimental archaeology in Ukraine. We have agreed on the annual reporting on the implementation of project for October. This group included university representatives, lecturers, reenactors, archaeologists, and a number of craftsmen. We have been working on creating a school of experimental archaeology with the involvement of students and specialists from various educational institutions and historical reserves. In order to obtain clarification of the request from the Ukrainian side, we conducted a small survey to understand the settings and needs of our colleagues. As a result, we received 14 responses that allowed us to determine general trends in needs. And this is professional, specialist, specialized information and resources. An important topic that I want to explain to you is our motivation. First is duty to previous generations and ancestors. First, we feel responsibility for preserving the memory of people thanks to whom we live now. Both our ancestors and those who preserved our tradition language gave their lives for it. Also about the different cultures, peoples who lived on our land. For me personally, it is important that the memory lives on in the future generations. Second, the desire of contribute to the development of the country and people. War is a sign that it is necessary to work more and more productively. Also, take steps to change the existing system that does not give the desired result. We have like-minded people, friends in various institutions who work for the implementation of reforms and changes. Some of them serve in armed forces of Ukraine and is now physically on the front. Realizing that some of them will not be able to return to their previous work, or it will take time. An important fact that gives confidence to the future is the students, among whom there are enthusiasts who are energetic and want to make real changes, and we are taking steps to improve cooperation with them. That is a responsibility to children and future generations. We realize that the future depends on our actions. Therefore, we try to do everything so what our successors and our children have a better basis for work, and society is more conscious and united. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for your words, and we'll come back to that I'm sure. I also prepared a few pages, only 4. I titled this that nobody should be excluded from culture. And I want to thank everybody here for being here. I also want to thank people online who are watching this. I also want to thank all the different sponsors who made it possible that you could come here, and that actually Ukraine is not anonymous anymore. Because I think that that's an important aspect. You see it on TV, and so you say, well, I've never been in that city. I don't even know how it's called until 5 minutes ago. And now it's that, but now you see real people from it's not anonymous anymore, I would say. I want to thank you for helping us to bridge between the different groups within your country and within EXARC and the rest of the world, so to say. I also want to thank Aimée for taking the initiative for bringing us together with the Sun initiative. That was very useful. And the reason why culture is so important was described very well by a former German Bundespräsident von Weizsäcker, who had a quote from 30 years ago or so. He said, "Culture is not a luxury that we can afford or just cancel, but it's the intellectual basis that secures our actual inner survival." And indeed, in the beginning I was asking Yarema, electricity, water, life, yes, but also culture. And I think that's clear for most of us by now. We see experimental archaeology, open-air museums, living history, etc. as a cloud of themes and people without borders. Holistic, if you like, and it does not matter if you are a professor or a craftsperson, living history enthusiast, or museum staff, or some of all of that. There are many people with many different roles involved in this kind of telling the story which we learn through archaeology. And I've tried to talk several times with Ukrainian colleagues, and I think we know what we can offer, but we don't really know what you need. And I think that's what you brought to the point very well. We as a network, or as within or outside EXARC, doesn't really matter. We maybe not have a huge amount of money, but we have the network. And it's up to you to say, we need people casting bronze, or we need people helping us with the academic side of this world. It's a network, and we will help you push the button of the part of the network you will need. We offer conferences and online presentations like this, and especially like a day today, you will find people with similar interests. I think you've seen things from all around the world already now, and we are very interested also to see what's happening in your part. But some of the places and the people you mentioned are already presented, for example, in several articles in the EXARC journal, which you published over the last couple of months. So that's a useful source. But we just we pass on the message. That's all we can do. And that linking pin is sitting here. It's also for you here in the room. If you have time today or tomorrow, visit Yarema, visit Maria, talk with them, see what you can do one-on-one, so to say. And that's what we want to do. We want to link people who all believe that we can tell stories based on our past, of which all of us can learn. Some things, some ideas which you mentioned before were already there 4 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but because of this war, I think we're coming closer together faster than before. And maybe that's a small positive side effect of the war. And as I said before, it's suddenly not anonymous anymore. When you hear, I mean, a week ago there was some message like, "Oh, museum was bombed and a staff member died." Yeah, it could have been his friend. So it suddenly is not that anonymous anymore. And we'll tell everybody, please reach out, join the Sun Ukraine network, the Support Ukraine network, and all your time is valuable and needed to help to build up a meaningful network where Ukraine plays an important role. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. So back to me again. I think we've covered a lot of the who, though I hope the who does expand to include several people here in the near future. Just to say that really we are the initial members of the network, but we do hope to expand. We're starting small, but we're really hoping that we'll get your collaboration in the near future. So what we have also covered, thinking about how we can facilitate mentorship and resources. So that is really at the crux of what we're trying to do. And how. So the main part of the how is that we're linking up our Ukrainian partners with our global partners, and they are yet to be determined, and you might be one of them. So I've broken this down into our more kind of immediate and longer term goals. So in the immediate right here, right now, we are looking to develop a really more kind of coordinated plan and look at some of the, like, who is it that is actually going to be involved, and really start to identify who our partners will be in the network. But this is not an easy thing to do. It is quite complicated. There are different sorts of limitations that we need to consider, and what we want to attempt to do during this meeting in Poland is to really start to identify what those challenges are and start mitigating against them to ensure that the network runs smoothly. And of course, an essential part of this discussion is going to be thinking about what our agenda is going forward. So in the more medium term, and I think this is really where Yarema and colleagues in Ukraine have been particularly helpful in pushing things forward, is identifying what the specific needs are. And that's already started to come out of that survey that you ran as part of the conference, thinking about what is it that is actually going to be useful. How can we make a real difference? What is it that is required from us as the global partners? And then thinking about partnerships that are actually going to function and be practical. Not just this sort of notional idea that we're going to partner this person with this partner and it's going to look good on social media and we're going to tick that box. That's not what we're trying to achieve here at all. What we want to do is to partner up organizations and individuals which are really genuinely going to support each other. And that is going to be a two-way knowledge exchange, because this is us also learning from our Ukrainian partners, and we see this as being a kind of a two-way dialogue and potentially multi-way dialogue. In the longer term, we're really interested, and this partly touches on some of the images you saw with those living history museums in Ukraine, which are still open and still very much active and still very much taking in visitors. And perhaps that's something that, well, personally, maybe I'm completely naive, but I didn't realize the scale at which many of these places are still open and functioning, and what a valuable kind of space these are for Ukrainians. So really thinking about how we can support these organizations which are still open and very much active. And thinking about the different types of needs that they might have, from the fiscal, managerial, and thinking about the kind of knowledge resources which might be helpful for them as well. And that is not just now, but thinking about the longer term future of places, these open air museums, in the longer term, when Ukraine wins the war, and Ukraine opens up to tourists, which it will, and we see an influx of the likes of all of the people in here wanting to visit these really important cultural spaces, okay? So thinking about it in terms of now and post-war. And then we want to think about some of the kind of avenues that might be accessible to us, especially in Europe, where we do have means to access, or beyond Europe, to different types of funding resources, and who can help us with that? Who has knowledge about different funding schemes that we might be able to apply to actually get some of that kind of all-important financial support to keep this network running? Getting down to the sort of the nitty-gritty, the kind of finer detail, is actually there's a lot of sort of practical types of discussions that we need to have about how are we actually going to do this? What is it going to look like? How are we going to keep this organization running? So that's things like, how are we going to communicate with each other as a group? How are we going to ensure that we can share our data safely and easily between different countries? And I think even right down to the level of what kind of format and frequency do we need to have these meetings to sustain it, so that it doesn't just sort of blow out in a couple of months' time when focus changes, or people start to think that everything is okay, or that there is less desire or motivation. So we need to make it in such a way that there is going to be this continued support. And we plan at least, we'll be having several meetings as a network in the interim, but also we would like to have another kind of broader, bigger scale meeting in 6 months' time. And the obvious place to have that would be, once again, here in Poland, perhaps a bit closer to the border of Ukraine. So that's some of the kind of fundamentals about what we're trying to do, some of the practical limitations and challenges, but also some of the potential.
At this point, we'd like to have some questions from people here about the presentations and ideas about how we can implement some of the things that were discussed.
You mentioned craft therapy sessions, and would it be worth offering that to Ukrainian refugees in the UK or the countries that we're all based in? For example, I work at the Ancient Technology Centre, and could we offer that kind of thing specifically to Ukrainians to help develop it for when they return back home when they can?
Maybe it's actually probably a good question for you to answer. Olga, what do you think would be?
Well, sir, I am part of Ukrainian community in the UK, and I know that it's really a problem. A lot of people has mental problems, and it's really a fantastic idea that you suggested. And I know a lot of people that would like to join this project. Thank you.
We're looking for funding also for projects, cooperation projects between, let's say, several people or organizations in Ukraine and several people or organizations elsewhere in the world. And options pop up every now and then, or quite often, I must say. But for example, ICOM, the International Museum Organization, has now an option. They have 20,000 euro for cooperation between Ukraine and elsewhere in the world. But then the other partners have to bring in 5,000 euro just to cover the other part, missing part, so to say. And the deadline is in 2 weeks. It's not the only thing, and we're probably not going to make this deadline, but there are going to be continuous deadlines for things like this. So it's a chicken-egg situation. It's best to first think, okay, who can we link together? How can we find the money? Sometimes it's just 20,000, but it can make a big difference. Such small project. I'm not talking about bigger long-term projects at the start, but this is, for example, a very straightforward option. Okay, who of you has 5,000 euro, then we get started. I know it doesn't work that way, but it sometimes gets something very practical. Okay, how do we do this? Thank you.
I can say that, as you know, in Poland we strongly support Ukraine, and I can't promise anything right now, but I will try to recognize the situation at my university, and we will try to support the program. Okay, and I wanted to say something for you, Yarema, but as I see this discussion is very rhetoric and serious, so I decided, not to say such a stupid words that I had in my mind. So it's better to talk seriously because the subject is the issue is very serious. Okay.
Thank you. As well as Poland, in Latvia, we are also very strongly supporting Ukraine. And I have a workshop space available. I'd be very happy to share that with the Ukrainian community.
Mine is sort of a functional question. For those of us that want to help but don't exactly know how we can help, is there a communication system that you'll be using for this? Is it emails? Or is it going to be more of an open-based communication system like a forum that we'll be able to use to have these discussions when we start coming up with better ideas? Or if we, say, happen to be presented an opportunity ourselves that we can extend to someone, how would we go about getting that kind of information or giving that kind of information?
For Ukrainian side, we send in and speak in with emails, or again Zoom, or what you want the system. For now, a few of reserves and institutions are on the contact, and it's not a problem to choose those system and what you want and what it will be for you useful.
Yeah, if you want to contact somebody and after this conference and you cannot speak directly with Yarema, you can also check it with EXARC, and we will we'll bring you in touch. That's our task, to link people together, and with Yarema as linking pin on the other side, sorry to call it the other side, he will be able to say, oh, but for this idea you need to talk with that guy, or for this idea you need to talk with that lady. So the links are quite short and quite strong.
Yeah, that's a good question, Jesse, and that's one of the practicalities that we're trying to work through as well. And so we're going to probably be creating a kind of a database which has that information in it, which will allow us to connect up interested parties. So yeah, thank you. Do please get in touch with either EXARC, Yarema, or even myself if you need to, or Jess, and we can work it out.
Yes, I have a question to Olga and Yarema. How many museums, open museums, experimental archaeology centers were destroyed by the Russian invasion? Do you have any data on this topic already? And if do you know maybe if there are any already plans of the Ukrainian government to rebuild those places?
Thank you for your question. For now, the part of museums are on occupied territories, and we don't know how they work really. Some of museums were destroyed, but in Ukraine there is few such open-air museums like in Poland or Britain, UK, or in Germany. We have few ethnographic sconces and projects that are started. We for now we haven't open-air museums that was determined destroyed. Yes, we don't have like this. But we have open-air museum. We have historical reserves that we want to create open-air museums. And if you want to support and work in this field in Ukraine, it will be very effective and I think useful.
We have a heritage emergency. We have a heritage emergency response initiative that work in these questions, and they have concrete information about how many reserves, how many museums, how many destroyed, and was you can in the site went to the site and see detailed information about.
The statistic is on that site. You can
people,
see. I don't know.
From the first days of war, some people start to work in these questions. They went to the place, try to save what they can to save. And next week, director of the History Museum died in the place of work in the museum because it was a massive attack in Ukraine. And she tried to save people and tried to save collection, but she lost her life.
I would just like to say, help can be very simple. There were some people sponsoring, for example, this visit of Yarema and his family, sending €10. And small things, big things, Aimée does quite much, a lot more than that. So help can have many faces and many shapes. And I thank you very much for your attention. This will not end so easily, I'm afraid. And I hope that we will have some good out of this. But you want to say something more?
Yes, I want to say thank you, Roland, personally, Aimée, Jess, who encourage us in these hard days of war. But we feel that we are not alone in this world. It's very important. And thank you for our sponsor that gives to we can participate in this conference. We really thank you. And thank you all that who support Ukraine in different ways and even watch news and knows what is going on. And also thank you from all countries that people participate, that people send money, send humanitarian for Ukrainians. It's very important, and thank you for you. We feel that we are not alone, like this. We believe that our work in Ukraine in this specific thing, this experimental archaeology, is very important because our cultural heritage is under attack for now. But the real object, this ships, crafts, all that you're doing, it's very important for kids, for people who don't know their history. There is part of Ukrainians that don't understand this situation really. But the history and experimental archaeology can give them more information and realize what was past and what can be future. And thank you for you, friends.